Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandro Tejada, Director of Major Gifts and the Seton Hall Parents Program. Thank you for joining us during Seton Hall Week in our virtual offering, Back to School class with Dr. Kelly Harris, Director of Africana Studies at Seton Hall University. This session is being recorded. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We will have an on-demand page, and we'll add all our Seton Hall Week recorded sessions to the page. And again, please kindly mute yourself. And if you have any questions during this session, please use the raise your hand icon on the top right of your screen. Definitely use the chat feature to share any questions or hold your questions until our Q&A session. And I'm honored to have the privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Harris. As I mentioned, Dr. Harris is the Director of Africana Studies at Seton Hall University. His areas of expertise include Black politics, African politics, Black thought, African American history, and the history of social science. His most recent publications are The Search for a Black Political Science, The Epistemology and Relevance of Matt Jones in the National Political Science Review, and number 45 in The Persistence of White Nationalism in Not Our President, New Directions from the Pushed Out, the Others, and the Clear Majority in Trump's Stolen America. He is currently working on a manuscript, Quicksand, The Slow Demise of Black Alternatives to American Social Science. Dr. Harris is a graduate of Temple University, where he received his bachelor's degree, The Ohio University, he received his master's, and Clark Atlanta University, where he received his PhD. Thank you, Dr. Harris, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Sandro. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, parents, friends, alumni, administrators. So I'm going to jump into a presentation. And the question I always want you to keep in mind while I'm doing this presentation is, why is this information important? Why should we know this? And that's what we want to have. I want you to consider that when we get to the discussion piece. And I'll also encourage you, please, after I go through this presentation, I'm gonna go through a little quick, because I want to reserve enough time where you all can share your thoughts, your comments, your questions, or your concerns about the presentation. This is a presentation that I use in my Introduction to African American Studies course. I also use parts of this presentation in a class I teach on the history of the Civil Rights Movement. And I also use a part of it as well in a class I do on African American leadership. So let's get into it. I'm going to share and pull up my PowerPoint. And where are we at here? Just a second. Here we go. All right, somebody please unmute themselves and just tell me that you can see the slide.
I can see it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so here we go. Now we want to deal, I chose this discussion about Montgomery Bus Boycott because most people know of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Well, what's been happening in the last 20 to 25 years, a lot of scholars have really been unearthing the long history of the bus boycott and the people behind it, because often when people think about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, they think of two people. And who are those two people? People can unmute themselves and just say who those two people are that you think of when we think about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Who are those two people?
Rosa Parks and Dr. King.
Rosa Parks and Dr. King, thank you. All right, but it's so much more than that, and that's what we're going to get into. This cover picture you see here, it really shows there were so many Black women who were arrested during the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and we'll get into detail for some of those who were arrested before that. So now, whenever we deal with an issue like this, one of the key things I always try to keep in mind and emphasize to students is all the different events, people, and organizations that intersect with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And these are very important for us to know in terms of its place in American history. No event, no activist event, no protest movement starts in a vacuum. It starts in a particular context, and it's always very important for us to understand the larger context. from which that bus boycott or any movement started. And these are some of the names and people, some of them we'll talk about and discuss in this presentation. Now, the first thing that people have been doing is going back and getting people to understand about Rosa Parks. One of the myths about Rosa Parks was that she was just tired that day on December 1st, 1955, when she refused to give up her seat. That was the myth. That's what people grew up with. Rosa Parks was just tired one day. And that's a myth. Rosa Parks was an activist, and her activism goes back to 1931. So that's 24 years before the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And Rosa Parks, this is where she met her husband-to-be, Raymond Parks. They organized around the issue of the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 young men between the ages of 13 and 19 who were unjustly incarcerated and convicted for raping 2 white women, which they did not do. And the white women recanted their testimony. And it took years for people organizing around this issue. And Rosa Parks was one of the organizers to get all of the boys freed. And you see here, the labor defender, the Communist Party of the United States, really took the lead in trying to get the boys free. Now, part of that was they believed that they were free, but also they saw that as an opportunity to really make outreach to the Black community. So Rosa Parks, even after that, one of the things that became more well-known recently is Rosa Parks' leadership and advocacy for Recy Taylor. Recy Taylor was a Black woman who was brutally raped in Alabama. And this book here, for those of you who are interested in reading more about it, At the Dark End of the Street, this is a book that I use, one of the books that I use in my History of the Civil Rights Movement class, because it really reframes who Rosa Parks was as an activist, but it also reframes Black women's activism and Black women's role in these particular movements. So we're going to look at a little bit about Rosa Parks and her role in organizing this committee for equal justice for Recy Taylor. But let me pause here for a moment and say this about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, when she was younger, she really was influenced by her grandfather. She recalled a story when her grandfather was sitting on the porch waiting, had a shotgun waiting for the Ku Klux Klan. And Rosa Parks said she just was sitting there waiting, and she said she wanted to see her grandfather shoot some Ku Kluxers. And her family was worried about her radicalism, because Rosa Parks was radical. She was not, the image of her is just this tame and docile woman, again, who was tired one day, but she wasn't. She was somebody who really believed and had a lot of pride and really believed in for standing up and speaking up against injustice from a young age. And this is the committee that she chaired, the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Recy Taylor. So you see the story of her when she was raped. And Rosa Parks, and if you look at the bottom, Rosa Parks led the committee that garnered support from W.E.B. Du Bois, Adam Clayton Powell, Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Mary Church Terrell, and Black leaders all across the country. So what's important in saying this and detailing this is this. Rosa Parks was in conversation and discussion with Black activists and leaders across the country. Now, this rape of Recy Taylor is 14 years before the Montgomery Bus Boycott, right? So that, again, gives you an example of this. And at the time, Rosa Parks was a leader in the NAACP, which we'll see in a minute anyway. So this is the part of the network of people who advocated for Recy Taylor, for justice. Now, why do I put this here? Again, it gives you an example of who Rosa Parks is talking to, who she's working with. These Black newspapers, Alabama Tribune, Birmingham World, Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, California Eagle, Southern Negro Youth Conference, Southern Conference for Human Welfare, International Labor Defense, Communist Party of the United States. Now, why do I put this here? Oftentimes, particularly students, and I would dare I say adults, have never heard of some of these organizations and some of these newspapers. The civil rights movement was so broad, and it was very broad, and it really expanded at the local level in so many states and so many cities, right? And that's what we want to try to get people to understand, that the leadership that we saw in the civil rights movement, and really any movement, it really isn't top down. It really isn't hierarchical. It really starts at the grassroots. And a lot of names and people we don't know, a lot of women and men, but women in particular, because of course we live in a sexist society. History has been taught in a very sexist manner. We really want to retell these stories, recapture these stories and tell them, and really let people know that in order to change things, It takes a whole lot of people, and not just one great orator or one great activist. That's a lot of hands are in this. So this picture, Southern Conference for Human Welfare, which was founded in 1938, who focused on social justice and civil rights. Now, it's a couple people that become important in this. This couple here, where you see my cursor, Virginia Durr and her husband. Remember those names. Remember the Durr family. All right? I want you to remember that in this part of the story. Here we have Mary McLeod Bethune, who is the founder of Bethune-Cookman University, but also was the founder of the National Council of Negro Women. And Mary McLeod Bethune was also a part of FDR's Black Cabinet. And she had the most power, political power, of any Black woman in this country, really probably until a few people, really until the 1970s. We might say Barbara Jordan. Then we would say Condoleezza Rice. And then, of course, we would say Michelle Obama. But up until that time, Mary McLeod Bethune wielded more political power than any Black woman in this country's history. The Southern Negro Youth Conference really was conversing and on good terms with Rosa Parks and helped to assist in a case for Recy Taylor. In particular, there's one couple, James Jackson and Esther Jackson, and you see them here in their older years. But these are another activists who are very important in the movement. And this, I should also say this. Technically speaking, there's no civil rights movement. But again, historians have coming back and looking back and saying, it started earlier. Because initially people look at the Montgomery Bus Boycott as being the beginnings of the civil rights movement. But as we unearth all these different things, we realize, no, the movement really was before then. It was before that. And Rosa Parks was a part of that movement. Nannie Helen Burroughs, a board member who Rosa Parks came into contact with, who at this time was an elder in our community. But here's one of the interesting things about Nannie Burroughs. She was a founding member of the first national Black women's organization in this country's history, the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. She was a founding member. She also started her own school for Black girls. And the interesting thing is, and I believe she may have been the first person to require an African-American history class for her students. And this was an all-girl school. And she required this in the early 1900s. She required this of her students. Charlotta Bass, editor and owner of the California Eagle, the largest Black newspaper on the West Coast at the time. And she became the first Black woman to run who ran for vice president on a national ticket. She ran for the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party, if you don't know, 4 years before, Coretta Scott King went to their conference and stumped for Henry Wallace in his race against Harry Truman, right? But they were progressive, is the word as you see in the title of the party, Progressive Party. But Charlotta Bass knew Rosa Parks and worked with Rosa Parks on a case for Recy Taylor and on other issues. Claudia Jones, another one, a leading communist, worked on a case about the Scottsboro Boys. She also was a member of the National Negro Congress and of course, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, prolific writer. She became a victim of the McCarthyism. She was jailed and then sent into exile, and she died in London. But she was a significant activist at that time, who many people do not know. People are learning more and more about her now, but many people do not know. Now, another precursor for the bus boycott, the March on Washington movement. Now, many of you know the March on Washington, 1963, but in 1941, the March on Washington movement began. And A. Philip Randolph, who you see here in this picture, threatened an all-Black March on Washington, right, for jobs and for justice, okay? Now, here's what's interesting about this piece. A. Philip Randolph is seen as the father of the March on Washington movement. But here's what's interesting. A. Philip Randolph was at a mass meeting in Chicago talking about these issues about the armed forces and what Black people place in them. And a random Black woman in a crowd got up and said, "We need to have a march on Washington and demand our rights." And A. Philip Randolph said, "That's a great idea, sister. I'll lead that movement." And that's how the March on Washington movement began. We have a bus boycott, the Harlem Bus Boycott, 1941. And you see here in the middle of the picture, Adam Clayton Powell one of the more effective Black congressmen in this country's history out of New York, and he also was a pastor at the historic Abyssinia Baptist Church. Adam Clayton Powell led this Harlem Bus Boycott, and where you see it was successful, led to the hiring of 200 Black transit workers, right? And again, why do I show this in the context of we're talking about the Montgomery Bus Boycott? It's always important to show students the context, the larger context for things that were happening during that time, and to point out leaders who they may probably have never heard of. Some of you probably have heard of Adam Clayton Powell, particularly those of you all who are in the New York area. I'm sure you've heard of Adam Clayton Powell, but most of our students have not. Now, Irene Morgan, this was a significant Supreme Court case. In 1944, she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the Greyhound bus. Her case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court outlawed segregation on interstate travel, right? This was Morgan v. Commonwealth, Virginia, 1946. Very important Supreme Court decision. This Supreme Court decision would lead to the first freedom rides. We had the first freedom riders, because oftentimes we talk about the freedom riders in the 1960s, but the first freedom riders were 1947. And it was a Fellowship of Reconciliation. It was an interracial organization who did this journey of reconciliation in 1947. And their attempt was to try out the law, to try out, since the Supreme Court had said segregation on interstate bus travel was illegal, they wanted to try it out. And this gentleman, if you follow my cursor, this gentleman in the middle, his name is Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was was mentored by A. Philip Randolph. He was a founder of the Congress of Racial Equality. He was a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, but he also became a friend and mentor to Dr. King on nonviolent direct action. So a very important figure. One of the reasons a lot of people did not hear about Bayard Rustin, even though he was a master strategist, is because he was homosexual. And that's why we didn't learn more, people didn't know more about Bayard Rustin. Baton Rouge Bus Boycott, 1953, Reverend T.J. Jemison. Another point to point out to students. You saw Adam Clayton Powell, who's a congressman and a pastor. You see Reverend T.J. Jemison. When we look at the movement, when we look at not just the civil rights movement, but when we look at the Black freedom struggle in America, the Black church is front and center of that Black freedom struggle. No matter what decade we look at, if you want to see progress by Black people, if you want to see organizing, it always has been connected to the Black church, right? And Dr. King would consult with T.J. Jemison about the Baton Rouge Bus Boycott and try to learn some lessons from there. I'm not going to spend much time on this. You all know Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, outlawing segregation in public schools, and what kind of ripple effect that had. Some other important people who became important for organizing, particularly in Alabama. One in Alabama, Ella Baker is a national organizer. But you see here, this woman, Ella Baker. I'm not sure if you all have heard of her before, but Ella Baker was one of the more significant organizers in the 20th century. She was a founding member of Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was Dr. King's organization. You saw she's an NAACP field secretary. She would go across the country and organize NAACP chapters across the country. She is an organizer going all the way back to the late 1920s. And she became a friend and mentor to Rosa Parks. The gentleman beneath her is E.D. Nixon, who was the leader in Montgomery, Alabama, going back to the 1930s. He was the leader of the Montgomery Voters League, Montgomery Welfare League, then, of course, the Montgomery Improvement Association, NAACP chapter president, and he also was a member, the chapter president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which, by the way, was A. Philip Randolph's organization that he led, and was one of the more effective Black labor union organizations in this country's history. But E.D. Nixon would work closely with Rosa Parks in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, December 1st, 1955, that's the day Rosa Parks refused to give her seat and was arrested. But we see here, May 21st, 1954, Joanne Robinson, an educator, Alabama State University, she writes a letter to the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, threatening a boycott of the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, what does that tell you? I always ask students, what does that tell you? That tells you that the people in Montgomery, Alabama were already organizing, and that the buses weren't already an issue, right? So again, this isn't an instance of Rosa Parks being tired. Black people in Montgomery, Alabama, particularly Black women, were already saying we need to do something about these buses here in Montgomery, because they were treating Black women with disrespectfully, and Black women were the ones who were riding the buses more than any other group. So you see again, Joanne Robinson, she's a member of the Montgomery Improvement Association, also the Women's Political Council, and you see Bayard Rustin, who I just mentioned a few slides ago. So Rosa Parks is a leader in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. You see there, these three are the leadership of the NAACP in Montgomery: Edie Nixon, Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks' classmate from when she was a little girl, Johnny Carr, is also a leader, right, of the NAACP. The Durrs, and I asked you to remember the Durrs. Clifford Durr was a lawyer, and him and his wife, Virginia, were very close to Rosa Parks, okay? So Rosa Parks used to do some work for the Durrs, the Durr family. She was a seamstress, so she used to do some work for the Durrs. They were very supportive of her and her efforts, right? So remember, the Durrs are activists. The Durrs were ostracized by the white community in Montgomery, Alabama, because they were advocating for Black people. So they were ostracized by them, but the Durrs didn't let that stop them in their advocacy for rights and the end of racism and segregation and discrimination in Montgomery, Alabama. Another important person and an important organization, Mary Fair Burks, was the founder of the Women's Political Council and the classmate of Rosa Parks. But the Women's Political Council really becomes the backbone of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. They really are. They really become the backbone of it. And in no small respect, because of the work of Mary Fair Burks. And so one of the things that we have to consider, I just showed you the Rosa Parks, the other, her friend Johnny Carr also led the NAACP with her. Now you see another friend and former classmate, Mary Fair Burks, is a leader. What kind of education did they get? Where these Black women during that time in the 1940s and 1950s would take leadership in their communities and be activists, outspoken leaders. What kind of education did they get? Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns, some of you may have heard of, Baptist preacher, radical. Some of you may have seen the Vernon Johns story. James Earl Jones played him in the movie. It's a very good movie. But Vernon Johns was the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before Dr. King got there. And his congregation thought he was too radical, right? Give you an example of Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns was arrested for refusing to give up his seat on the bus. Vernon Johns was taken to the police station, and he started giving them a sermon about racism. And he started giving them a sermon. He wouldn't shut up. So the police said, you know what? Let him go. They didn't hold him. They didn't try him. They didn't charge him anything. They said, listen, man, just go. Just leave. They didn't want to hear his sermon. But that's how he was. He was very outspoken. But he preceded Dr. King at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. September 1st, 1954, Dr. King becomes the pastor of Baptist Church. Now, why do I put this here? So remember, I started this whole discussion tonight by saying, who are the two people generally associated with the Montgomery Bus Boycott? Dr. King and Rosa Parks, right? I showed a slide that in May 21st, 1954, Joanne Robinson wrote a letter threatening a boycott of the buses. That's before Dr. King even is in Montgomery, Alabama, all right? And as an aside, when Dr. King took the position, Dr. King was a graduate student. He just finished his graduate studies at Boston University. Dr. King received a phone call by somebody asking for a ride, said, I heard you're going to Montgomery to interview for a position. Mind if I ride with you? That person was Vernon Johns. So Dr. King rode from Boston all the way to Montgomery, Alabama with Vernon Johns, who was the pastor of the church that he was interviewing for to take his position. And Vernon Johns told him all about Montgomery, Alabama, all about his congregation. March 2nd, 1955, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested for refusing to give up her seat. All right. I generally play a little video here, but I'm not going to play the videos tonight because I'm interested in hearing your feedback and what you want to say. But Claudette Colvin was arrested. She was the youngest person arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And the black women in Montgomery, Alabama wanted to start a bus boycott right then and there. But the men in Alabama said no, because Claudette Colvin had a reputation for being outspoken, but not long after she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat, they found out that she was pregnant. And by that time, she was 16. And the men said, no, we cannot use her as the face of the movement, that her circumstances would delegitimize the movement. Another black woman is arrested, Aurelia Browder, April 1955, for refusing to give up her seat. And again, the women of Montgomery, Alabama were ready to go, but the men said no. And this is the elitism. The men said she doesn't come, her family is not the kind of family that should be put out in front. So that raises a serious question. So that's another internal issue that we always have to grapple with. And in August 1955, we see the brutal assassination of Medgar Evers. And the picture you see, which I think you all know pretty well by now, this picture ran in Jet magazine. The mother, Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, wanted to have an open casket. She wanted the world to see what happened to her son. And the important piece of this is these pictures, this brutal assassination of Emmett Till inspired a lot of people to get involved and to do something about what was happening in the South, right? Rosa Parks, that summer of 1955, she goes to the Highlander Folk School. The Highlander Folk School was a school in rural Tennessee, organized by this man, Miles Horton, to really train activists and to give things on activists. So when Rosa Parks went when they were having a discussion, a seminar titled Racial Desegregation, Implementing the Supreme Court Decision. Now, a little bit more context. Rosa Parks went to the school. She was sent there. Her fee was paid by the Durr family, Virginia and Clifford Durr. Remember, the white family who she used to work for. They paid her way. And the reason they did that, Rosa Parks was feeling down. Why? At the end of the 1940s, beginning in the 1950s, a lot of organizations purged their membership rolls to ensure that they were not communists in their organizations. And this came from pressure that they received from the Truman administration to root out all communists in the country. So the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama went from having hundreds of members to having less than 50 members. And that left Rosa Parks really down. And then, of course, the assassination of Emmett Till, she really was down. So that's why the Durr sent her there. And that really re-energized her. And she was mentored by this woman, Seton McClark. Seton McClark was an educator from South Carolina and who was a leader of the NAACP in South Carolina. But when the NAACP was banned in South Carolina, she refused to give up her membership. So she was ran out of South Carolina. And Seton McClark came to Tennessee, and she was teaching the Highlander Folk School. But Seton McClark was one of those teachers. She was teaching people how to vote. She was teaching people how to organize. And she was also teaching people about literacy training. Brilliant teacher, often who many people do not know of. October of that year, Mary Louise Smith, when she was 18 years old, another black woman arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus. So there were at least 4 black women who were arrested before Rosa Parks for refusing to give up their seat. But Mary Louise Smith, again, didn't come from the correct kind of family. So again, the women wanted to move, but the men said no. Then November 27th, Mamie Till, there were T.R.M. Howard. T.R.M. Howard was a medical doctor. He was also one of the wealthiest men in Mississippi. He was going across the country trying to get support for Mamie Till and trying to get justice for Emmett Till. But Mamie Till spoke at a church that Rosa Parks was attending. on November 27, 1955. And so I show this because, again, these things aren't coincidences, all right? So when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat 4 days after that. So why does Rosa Parks refuse to give up her seat? She refuses to give up her seat. She went to the Highlander Folk School, the murder of Emmett Till, right? And she saw Mamie Till. She heard Mamie Till speak about her son. She sat in the front and heard Mamie Till. So Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat the next day. And remember, the other women had already been arrested. Remember, black women in Alabama, Montgomery had already said that. Not only that, when Rosa Parks that day, when she was refused to give up her seat, the bus driver who she had a run-in before in the early 1940s, Rosa Parks was arrested. She had a run-in with the bus driver. That bus driver got off the bus, went to the box to call the police because, you know, that's how it was back then. And all he said was, "It's her again." So that gives you a sense that Rosa Parks was already known as an activist. But Rosa Parks was a leader in the community. She was a part of the NAACP. She was a part of the Women's Political Council. I shouldn't say a part of the NAACP. She was a leader in the NAACP. We saw how she also was for the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Recy Taylor. We saw how she was in conversation with black leaders all across the country, men and women, and black organizations and black newspapers. So when her case hit, Edie Nixon and them said, yes, now we have it. So Edie Nixon went with the Durrs to jail. They bailed Rosa Parks out. They all had a meeting at the home of Rosa Parks. Her mother was there. And Edie Nixon said, we want your case to be the case. We want to start the bus boycott with this. Her husband, Raymond, who had been an activist when she met him, he wasn't as much as an activist now when this happened. Raymond was hesitant. He really didn't want her to do it because he knew what kind of pressure this would put on the family and what could happen to the family. Her mother didn't want her to do it. And Rosa Parks said, do you really need me to do it? And they said, yes, we need your case. And Rosa Parks said, okay, right? So here are some other people who were involved. And of course, we have Fred Gray, a young lawyer who helped Rosa Parks in her case, and Rufus Lewis, who was a businessman who owned this Citizens Club in Montgomery, Alabama. This club was where they would hide all the documents from the Montgomery Improvement Association. And this is a letter on December 5th, the bus boycott that Joanne Robinson sent out to people in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm going to read the letter. Another woman has been arrested and thrown into jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down. It is the second time since the Claudette Colvin case that a Negro woman has been arrested for the same thing. This has to be stopped. Negroes have rights too. For if Negroes did not ride the buses, they could not operate. 3/4 of the riders are Negroes. That's an important figure, you all. 3/4 of the riders are Negroes. Yet two were arrested. Yet we are arrested or have to stand over empty seats. If we do not do something to stop these arrests, they will continue. The next time it may be you or your daughter or mother. This woman's case will come up on Monday. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. You can afford to stay out of school for one day if you have no other way to go except by bus. You can also afford to stay out of town for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk. But please, children and grown-ups, don't ride the buses at all on Monday. Please stay off all buses, right? Now, an interesting thing also about that letter. Joanne Robinson wrote in the part of that letter, she said, we are going to boycott the buses on December 5th, 1955, whether Rosa Parks wants to or not, right? So again, Rosa Parks is a leader. Dr. King is a leader, but they did not start the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It was already in motion, and it would have happened whether they would have agreed to it or not. Now, that particular day, Dr. King was chosen. He was selected to be the leader of the bus boycott. And the reason he was selected as president of the organization of the first mass meeting, and this is a picture of the first mass meeting, by the way, the reason he was selected was because he was an outsider. and he was young and talented, but he was an outsider. So he didn't have any conflict with other people that other people may have had. So everybody pretty much got along with Dr. King at that time. And E.D. Nixon is the one who suggested that Dr. King be the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And this picture you see here, when he gives the speech discussing the Montgomery Bus Boycott, on his way to the church, he was still writing his speech because he earlier that day, he just got selected. He didn't even know he's going to be selected. So he was on his way there, he was writing down what he would say. And another way of the sexist practices of the day, Rosa Parks was there at the church. Rosa Parks asked one of the leaders, one of the organizers, she said, should I say a few words? And they said, no, you don't have to say anything. You shouldn't say anything. And that was it. Rosa Parks should have spoken that day, and she did not. So that's a part of the sexism in the movement. The bus boycott, of course, begins on December 5th. And remember that stat, 3/4 of the bus riders were Negroes, 75%, or 3/5, I'm sorry. 75% of the bus riders were Black people. So we can do math. We know that. If we don't ride the buses, they don't have a bus line. They don't have a bus company. It's not going to work. So the Black community knew if we stick together, we can win this. So that shows you that it wasn't willy-nilly or anything like this, that they really thought about it. They thought about how can we address discrimination in Montgomery, Alabama? Where are they weakest? And they said the buses, because 75% of us take the bus. Now, here's what's interesting. An interesting story why this worked. The Montgomery police force actually helped, and they didn't know it. So, as would happen during the time, when the leadership got wind that Black people were organizing to boycott the buses, the white power structures got a rumor that said young Black thugs were threatening Black people not to ride the buses. So, in all their infinite wisdom, the white power structure sent out police in full force to the bus stops out in Montgomery, Alabama, to arrest any young thugs. So there were Black people who were not going to ride, who were not going to participate. They were going to ride the bus. But on the way to the bus stop, they would see all these police officers, and the Black people said, oh, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not getting on that bus, right? So the police helped, and they had no idea that they were helping. Now, this is actually the case that ended the bus boycott, that said Black people were in the right. And notice Rosa Parks' name is not a part of that case. Her case was severed from these. So these are the 4 women who were arrested before Rosa Parks. This woman at the top, Black woman, Susie McDonald, was the oldest. She was in her 70s when she refused to give up her seat and was arrested. And the other ones we mentioned, Aurelia Browder, Mary Louise Smith, and Claudette Colvin, who was the youngest. And remember, at this time, Claudette Colvin was 15 years old. Mary Louise Smith was 18 years old when she was arrested. So the boycott ended after 381 days. All right. Let me stop sharing. So now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason, so I'll stop there. I want to take your comments. So we're already at 5:44. So I'll take any comments or questions from you. And I'm sorry I had to go so fast, but I wanted to get through it. Yes, Linda. Unmute yourself, Linda.
Sorry about that. My husband put on the faucet and I had to shut it off.
No, that's fine.
My apologies. I just wanted to thank you. It was a really mesmerizing presentation, and I look forward to getting the link to the whole thing so I can watch it from the beginning, because I missed a good part of it. But I learned so much, and it's my heart. I thank anybody who is engaged at all in speaking about the truth of American history. So thank you for that.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining. Questions, comments?
Dr. Harris, this is Sandro. You mentioned when you were talking about the women that started the boycott, what
Yeah.
was Rosa Parks' actual education that she received?
Rosa Parks was not a college graduate. Well, I'm sorry, she was a college graduate. But Rosa Parks didn't get anything beyond an advanced college degree. So much of Rosa Parks, really, her education, her real, I shouldn't say real education. Rosa Parks really was groomed into this by her activism starting back in the 1930s. She really was mentored by a lot of Black women who were leaders and activists in the movement from the 1930s and the early 1940s. And that's where she got a lot of that. And from her parents, her grandparents. Her grandfather was a Garveyite. He was a part of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So that's where she got a lot of her sensibilities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Dr. Harris, it's been really so informative. Thank you so much. I just curious as to your thoughts in listening to this with the role of, predominantly women, predominantly young women. I mean, we know, like you talked about, these types of movements at a grassroots have, occur at a grassroots level to really take traction, and it also from the youth. Yeah. And, some of these examples that you shared really depict that was indeed the case. I am curious, and I know that, like the topic of Black matriarchy has, pros and cons depending on how you perceive it. And I'm just curious as to your perspective.
Yeah, so let me put some context into that. Thank you for that question. So in 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a senator from New York, published what was called the Moynihan Report. But it was about civil disorders and what was going on in the urban communities. And one of the things he was criticized for was that he said that the Black community, one of the problems was that these households were led by women. And a lot of Black people really rejected that classification of the Black community. And I think he was incorrect then. And so even if we go back and look, there's always been strong Black women in our communities, but there's always been strong Black men as well. Now, one of the things that we've seen, and what I think that a lot of people didn't understand, and what Moynihan did not understand, that even when you have a situation where it might be a single parent household, that Black men were still involved in their children's lives, in their young men's lives. There's a study that came out just in the last decade that Black fathers were the most involved in any other group. This came out, and it was in a New York Times story. They reported on it and all these kind of things. This came out about the involvement of Black fathers. But the myth in this country has been that Black men are not engaged in any way, and that Black women run the household. But that whole thing about Black matriarchy was created really as a racist trope to really delegitimize Black families.
Thank you for that, and that's really, the perspective that I share from the reading that I've done. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? Nora, please, yes. You're muted, Nora.
Oh, sorry about that. And Sandra, I'm going to talk quickly because I know I got to meet with you. But Dr. Harris, this was excellent. I just wanted to say thank you for that. Kudos, getting your doctorate from CAU. My husband is also a CAU, got his graduate degree there. Yeah. But thank you for recognizing the role that women play. I actually wrote a paper about that my last year, because it is definitely one of those unknown facts in history about the role that women have played throughout many of the movements in our country. But thank you for this. This was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Anybody else? You all are too quiet. You remind me of students now.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's Linda again. Hi. I was thinking, has Rosa's story been made into a movie? I mean, what was the movie? My husband said yes behind me, because I thought her story was so powerful, and this whole thing of the women and the bus boycott. That's where I came in. Unfortunately, I missed before, but I was just really.
Yes, but you know what? There hasn't been any full. Um, yes, her story was made into a movie. I can't recall the name, but there hasn't really been anything that really captures who she was in terms of the breadth of her activism. I think something like that is needed. Even really, same thing for Dr. King, same thing for a lot of people. I think that's very much needed.
Well, I am a devourer of all stories of African Americans. I am just very grateful that the content that is being produced and the discussion that's being had as part of our racial reckoning is happening. I'm so grateful. So keep it going, Professor.
We will. We definitely will. And I'm proud, and I'm also should shout out one of my colleagues who has been doing this work here on this campus going back to the 1970s. Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett has joined us in the conversation.
Yay.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Mrs. Furlow, I see your hand up.
Yes, Dr. Harris, congratulations for such a very informative presentation.
Thank you very much.
I just wish all high schools could require this kind of education to our youth of not only students of color, Black and brown, but also non-Black and brown students. It's my belief that I think we would understand each other in a more positive way.
I agree.
Be able to understand each other's culture. And my husband and I are just so proud of you, Dr. Harris.
Thank you.
We're tuning in from Winmore, Pennsylvania, and our families have known each other for years.
Yes. Going
So
back to
we're
1970s.
Proud parents. God bless you, and we are pulling for you constantly.
Thank you. And let me say this, because this really goes back to, I think, Patricia's question. One of the things and the furloughs I have known, and the furloughs are like parents to me. They definitely mentored me, and I wouldn't be here if it were not for the love of the furloughs, Reverend Furlow and Mrs. Furlow, Mrs. Mary, and who are both educators as well. And that's really those kind of things you see that happen in Black communities that I think the larger communities aren't really privy to. So I grew up in my household. I had my mother and father, but they got divorced, so it was just my mother. But the furloughs were there and mentored me, took me in, wrapped their arms around me. So, so I am a product of a community and not just a household. And that's what I think a lot of people reject, the whole idea of matriarchy and criticism of single parent households, because it was the community that often wrapped their arms around Black children. And I'm a product of that. Patricia, your hand is up. Yes.
Thanks, Dr. Harris. My daughter is Catherine Roselle. I don't know if you remember Catherine, but she interviewed you. Go ahead, sweet.
It was the one class in the media. It was last year, I think.
I remember.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
She speaks so highly of you. So I was absolutely going to catch this call. But I wanted to just sort of bring up, current, the confluence of what I will call the perfect storm of COVID, Black Lives Matter, and the fact that I think traction. It seems like there's traction around, all these issues, the health disparities as a result of, COVID-19 in the Black community and other, people of color, that type of thing. All these horrendous events, George Floyd and, Breonna Taylor, I could name a list, right, of 10 strong.
Right.
I guess sometimes you just have to believe that in spite of how horrible this year has been, that is this finally the traction that's going to create a movement that shifts the pendulum.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's a good point. That I think that is a silver lining. We can only hope. But I want to go back to something that I think Linda said and Mrs. Furlow said. Education is the front line. And we really, I think the information that I'm sharing, I know I'm biased as a professor of Africana studies, but I think this information is something that all students should learn about. We really got to get people young because racism is taught. It's a learned behavior. So discrimination is a learned behavior. So we really have to be on the front lines with education about that. I'm optimistic, but I also know how hard it is to get substantive change in this society. And that's what people have to be willing to really work through and fight through. So it's not simply even changing laws. How do you change hearts and minds? And that's the real challenge. And I think that's one of the lessons that we learned during the Civil Rights Movement. You know, Dr. King learned that lesson because they got the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. They got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. And Dr. King, even after that was passed, he said, this isn't really it. This isn't it. You know, it's something else that we need to grapple with. And it's not just racism. It's tied up in issues of sexism. It's tied up in issues of poverty. So we have to grapple with these. And a lot of these take hard solutions that I think a lot of people do not want to make any sacrifice for. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road in terms of can we get over this hump. You can't have solutions. The type of solutions we need is going to take some sacrifice. And a lot of people don't want to have that kind of sacrifice. So I think that's something that's another hurdle we have to get over.
Thank you.
Reverend Dr. Pritchett?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are unmuted.
I just wanted to say hello to everybody, and I wanted to compliment whomever came up with the concept for this series of back to school kind of presentations. It's really pretty cool and pretty hip, I thought. But I also wanted to comment, somewhere within the past year or two, I saw when someone mentioned the Rosa Parks films, and there have been numerous films done on her, but one of the ones that I was most impressed with more recently was one in which her personal life, the personal side of Rosa, before she even became the public figure, in which there's a lot of interaction going on with her husband, who was then in the film is portrayed by Roger Guinevere Smith, another famous Black actor, who owned a barbershop. And these were, and emphasized their family life and their interaction as NAACP officials. So, but unfortunately, I can't think of the name of the film. So I would just say, if anybody who asked that question about good films on Rosa, you just drop me an email and I'd be more than happy to do the diligence and identify that the title of that particular film and send it to you. It was a commercial film and not a documentary as such. But I thought it was one of the better made pieces in that realm. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Rev. Thanks for that.
My pleasure.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, and we should mention too, this whole series too, that Reverend Dr. Pritchett had a freedom school this summer that we did virtually. And we're still going to be doing some more stuff around that. So please look for that. Yes, we're still going to be doing some more stuff around that.
And I don't know how many people can identify the freedom schools and their emergence in history. I could ask that as a trivia question. And now that it's almost 6 p.m., can anybody tell me where the freedom school concept comes from historically in American history?
Please.
Linda? Okay.
No, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat. I really want to know.
Okay, thank you very much. But for the record, for those who haven't heard my little history, but of a student, I entered college coming out of Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1961, and I went to Delaware, the Delaware State College then, now it's Delaware State University. And within 5 to 6 weeks on campus, most of us young people who never had a chance to travel much, who had grown up in Boston, Connecticut, New York, Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and found ourselves in Delaware, did not realize that things like institutional discrimination and segregation applied to Delaware in public accommodations. So within about 5 weeks of being on campus, a number of the freshmen, once again from the North, working along with some allies from Delaware, we facilitated a sit-in demonstration without any type of training nor coaching, if you would, from others. But after that sit-in and that we survived, we found out that 1 year earlier, down in Nashville, Tennessee, Dr. King and Ella Baker had facilitated a grouping hundreds of college students from historically Black colleges and other colleges throughout the South. They were trying to form a student unit of Dr. King's organization, which was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Once the students had all gathered, the students decided that they didn't want to necessarily be the student component of Dr. King's organization, but they thought it would be appropriate to have an organization of their own, which was named, the acronym would be SNCC, SNCC, which stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I say all of that because my roots get tied into that experience, and as such, that's where we begin to, my point of orientation is. But I'm going to share with all of you a story from that little segment. 2 weeks after that sit-in, we had some young white males who might have been Klan wannabes who late one evening on a Friday or a Saturday night, after we were showing movies on campus, we were walking back to our residence halls. These young men drove their cars up on campus, they turned the lights off, and they started mowing down students all over the place. None of us were killed, but many ended up in the hospital. So I just share that little story as a means of understanding the times that we lived in. When people see trucks being used in today's world for acts of terrorism, and you think this is something new and innovative, the reality is our communities have always been subjected to domestic terrorism. So I shared that one personally with you about being on the sanctity of a college campus, but there was no sanctuary. But in that context, shortly after that experience of terrorism, we decided to form a chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so that was the year of 1961. And in the summer of 64, as the Democratic Convention was preparing to enter Atlantic City, New Jersey for August, in the spring of 64, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee decided to send hundreds of college students from across the nation into Mississippi, and where we would conduct these freedom schools, in which we would teach adults who had not been allowed by the law to read or write. We would teach them to read and write, and particularly to read the Constitution of the United States of America, to let them know they had the right of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, as well as, I'll say, the ability to vote. So many of them had been deprived and of the right to vote. And that's where we launched over 40 freedom schools that summer. So in honor of what was going on in America this past year, I say honor, we wanted to do something that would honor like the high school students who were stepping up and getting involved in social justice. We also wanted to bridge that gap for many young people who had their, in a sense, educations disrupted a little bit, who had been sitting home for a while. And I think it was in July, for 5 Thursdays in July, we ran Freedom School in the evening, in which we talked about our history. We talked about ways of becoming leaders. We talked about how to become anti-racist. And we think many students were touched by our efforts. And God willing, we look forward to rolling out a similar series very soon now. Thank you very much, Brother Kelly, for that opportunity.
Thank you, Rev. Oh, I looked it up while you were talking. The name of that film you were referencing about Rosa Parks is The Birth of a Movement. Birth of a Movement.
Thank you very much. Got it.
No. Behind the Movement. I'm thinking about, I'll read two different things. Behind the Movement.
Gotcha. That almost sounds like, when you say Birth of a Movement, that's an extraordinary documentary series, by the way. I don't know if anyone has ever, but that's on PBS. But it deals with a reaction to the film The Birth of a Nation, and by I think by the NAACP and a few other organizations, and that's a whole nother story that we could probably get into on another occasion, about the significance of the film The Birth of a Nation. It was probably the first motion picture.
It was.
In terms of the technology being used to be produced in America. And as it worked out, well, as it was produced, it really shows the birth of the KKK in America.
Yeah.
So it is filled with as a black and white film, filmed with not only a lot of stereotypes, but in a sense, it gives you a look at how many people in the dominant group may have viewed stereotypically the behavior of black folks throughout the South and so forth. Thank you very much.
All right. Patricia, did you have another comment? I saw her hand up. Okay. Sandro, Jennifer, I think that might be it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harris. That was such a wonderful presentation. And just a reminder to everybody that we will post this presentation on our on-demand page. And that way we could have the ability to share it with people, our whole Seton Hall community. So once again, thank you guys for joining us. And if you have any questions or comments, I think I need to log off because Sandro has to start another event, and because he's the organizer of the sound, he's having issues. So thank you, everybody. And we do have a few more events tonight if you'd like to log on. I just posted in the chat the schedule of events and also the on-demand page. So thank you so much. And I hope that we'll be able to change hearts and minds of people. Thank you again with all this information that we just learned. Thank you.
Thank
you all.
Well, Kelly, I'm about to give you a call, Kelly.
when you're in college, it's a microcosm kind of a world, but it allowed me just some real life experience in a work environment